Welcome to segment 2, where we focus much more on what you need to understand about anxiety. And so why are we putting so much energy and a premium on anxiety? Is because it's such an issue. And here's what we know. First off, we know that 10% of elementary students have a diagnosable anxiety order, meaning that anxiety is so prevalent, that worry brain, that it's getting in their students' way to perform their job, which is typically school. So it's going to impact their school. The second is, again, we know from Douglas County data that it's one of the most common issues for truancy or missing is anxiety. And so it's a big issue. And we also know that with COVID and all the issues that we've dealt with COVID, that we're going to be seeing more anxiety issues overall. And the other reason of why focus on anxiety is because it usually shows up earlier in a person's life course. And if we can catch it early and give students tools and help them better learn to deal with that part of their brain, we are hopefully also helping them long-term deal with less mental health issues in the future, or have more tools to deal with the mental health issues they have. So that's why we're spending more energy on anxiety. So what is it that you really need to know about anxiety? And I call this the deeper dive. The first thing you need to know, like we started, is that every part of our brain has a job. And we talked about before, but just to remind you that anxiety too has a job. And its job is to keep you safe from biological threats. That's why it was created. That's why it was developed. All living things have it. It's part of our limbic system and our amygdala. And so imagine, as you can see on the screen, if technology were there and a cobra flew into your room, what would happen is exactly what we would want to happen. Our anxious system would lock in on the threat and make a decision for us of, do we run out of the room, which would be the most logical, best thing to do, or if not, what can we use to neutralize the threat? How do we keep ourselves safe? But some of us, if there was a cobra in the room, and we've learned this too, might know we should run, know we should do something, but be frozen. And that's when we get too much of an anxious spike of anxious energy running through, so we might freeze. So again, the first thing to know, anxiety has a job, and it's a very logical one. So if anyone ever says anxiety is not logical, there's actually a logic to it. And when it sees a threat, it wants to get you safe. Number 2 that we want you to understand about anxiety, and this is called the paradox of anxiety. And the paradox of anxiety is, as you can see, think of anxiety like a fire. And any time we listen to that anxiety and we do what it wants us to do, we are putting gasoline on the fire. We are making it stronger. We're making that connection stronger, that when I'm anxious, I should avoid or get out of there. And so that's where you can see on the graph, we can get caught up in this vicious cycle. And I'll give you an example, a kid who has a test coming. And so as the test is getting closer, they're getting closer to that big test, they're getting more anxious about it, they're wanting to avoid, it's making them nauseous, it's making them sick. And you as a parent or a teacher are witnessing this and witnessing them getting so upset. So you tell them, oh, it's not worth it. You don't have to take the test. And immediately that kid or student's anxiety just drops. Phew! I'm feeling so much better. But that's where we get caught up in that first loop. Because what we've taught our kids to do is when they're anxious, the right thing to do is to avoid. So the next time another test comes around, that's what they've learned to do. So the paradox of anxiety, and that's how it develops, is when we avoid things, and that's what we learn to do, when we feel anxious again, then we want to avoid. But then what happens, there are things that we don't want our kids to avoid, but if that's what they want to do, that's what we're going to keep wanting to do, and they get caught up in that vicious cycle. So what we're going to want to do with anxiety to not have that fire grow, to spread into other areas, it never stops with that one test or that one thing they get out of. It keeps spreading. What we want to learn to do is how to put water on the fire, which we're going to talk about. But the big thing you can already see, even from the graph, we're going to want to sit and help our kids not avoid things. And when we let them avoid, even with the best of intentions, remember we're fueling the anxiety fire. And that's because of this paradox. So now let's talk about the third thing that's really important with anxiety. And this is something I've actually coined. I call it the irony of anxiety. Because remember, anxiety's job is to keep us safe. But it really works under conditions of what we would call, or I call, biological threat. When there's a cobra in the room, sadly, if there was a gunman in a building, our anxiety system would take over, and it does a great job getting us to safety or figuring out how to neutralize the threat. But remember, folks, from the first segment, we've developed a smart brain. So now there's things we're not just biologically afraid of. There's things we're psychologically afraid of. And you can see on the screen some of those fears. We have a fear of failure, a fear of disappointment, a fear of death, a fear of being out of control, and a fear of being alone. These are our core fears, and every human has some sort of combination of those fears. But the problem is we respond to those fears just like we would a cobra. So as you can see in the picture, there's a kid with a test. So our anxiety system sees the test and it sees it as a threat. And remember, what do we want to do with cobras? We want to run away from them. So imagine now we run away from a test. And imagine if we run away from that test that we were afraid of failing, what's going to happen to the test that we can't study for or we don't take? We're going to fail it. So the irony of anxiety is when it comes to biological threats, we want to listen to it. When it comes to psychological threats, when we listen to our anxiety, we are going to make that fear come true. And I know this is a hard concept, so let me give you one more just to see, and we can do it with all our core fears. But let's say you have a big fear of being rejected or being alone. A very normal high school fear. It comes on really strong. So now this is what your anxiety is going to tell you. Don't talk to people. Don't raise your hand in class. Don't let people see the real you. Don't go to parties because you'll make a fool of yourself. Stay away. So imagine you listen to your anxiety and you do all those things and you avoid all these things because you don't want to be rejected or wind up alone. How are you going to wind up? You got it, alone. So the problem and why anxiety is such an issue in schools is most of the things that kids are going to experience anxiety-wise in schools are psychological threats. And when we let kids avoid or listen to their worry brain, instead of protecting them from that fear, it's going to make that fear come true. That the way to have fears come true is to listen to your anxiety. And so if you're a parent or a teacher, and you don't want your kids' fears to come true, you can't let them listen and do what their anxiety wants them to do. And that's such an important thing, and why we're spending this energy and time trying to help develop programming to break the power anxiety can have on us. And again, it does. It's millions of years of evolution that's telling us to avoid and sees everything as a cobra. And parents, that's why we want you to kind of understand too, or teachers, when a kid really is anxious, even though you might not see a cobra, That's what they're seeing. That's what they're experiencing. So that's really important. The next topic that really want you to understand is how do we overcome anxiety? Think of how we overcome anxiety as like learning to do any skill. And because we're in Colorado, let's think about skiing. And I don't know about you, but before I would put my kids on a mountain, I would want them to know a few things to get started. For me, I want them to know how to stop. I would want them to know how to turn. And my wife's big thing, she would want them to know how to get up, because it's really annoying to have to keep going to your kids and helping them get up. So those might be the 3 things before we get started with skiing that I want to teach them before we get on the mountain. Then once we're on the mountain, we would start at the right level of where they're at, and that might be the bunny slopes. And we would want them to get comfortable practicing those skills, using them in the setting. And as they do, when they get more comfortable, we would want to see them increase, and we would increase the level on the mountain. We would move to greens or blues or blacks. The same is true with anxiety. That a lot of kids who are anxious, they don't get the tools they need. And that was me when I was little. No one taught me tools to better manage when that part of my brain was going off. And I would just listen to it and believe everything it was telling me. And so I didn't have the tools, and we're going to talk about those tools. But once we have the tools, then we got to get our kids on the mountain and get them doing what they're afraid of. And we want to start at the right level, but as they get more confident and comfortable at that level, we want to keep increasing the scope of the work and help them see and get more confident. So what you'll see is a graph. What we're showing now is this is actually a meta-analysis, which is, think of it as the Rotten Tomatoes of every study that's been done on the effectiveness in therapy for kids of 30 years of data around certain mental health issues. And what this is showing is that we know the most around helping kids who are anxious. And when kids get these skills and they get put on the mountain and learn how to effectively manage their anxiety and do things, and the fancy term for that in the literature or in our world is called exposure treatment. When they get that combination, they improve. Their anxiety diminishes, such that, as you can see, that 3/4 of kids who go in and get this kind of treatment are significantly improved through the process. Where we're good at the other mental health issues, but we are the best with anxiety. So folks, one last thing we want you to be aware of is there's going to be a lot of terms underneath what we would call worry brains, all different kinds of worry brains and terms that might be thrown out, and want you to have a little bit of understanding. And so that's the last thing we'll put into this segment around Anxiety 101. And so the thing to understand, and what I like to call it, think of anxiety kind of like an umbrella. And there's all these different terms about things that we might avoid or things that our worry brain can worry about. So I will name the big ones that you might hear or be aware of for yourself if you want to look up and understand more. But the first one that can show up a lot with our younger kiddos, especially as we enter in the school year, is separation anxiety. And that's where our worry brain is worried about what might happen to a loved one if we're not around them, so it makes it difficult to separate. So our worry brain makes it really hard and doesn't want us to leave and always wants to know what our parents are doing or what you're doing or the teacher, because it worries about what could go wrong when we're separated. The next kind of worry brain is social anxiety, and that's where we worry about negative judgment or evaluation. So that can show up in schools around not just friendships and dating and making friends, but that's raising your hand in class, that's giving a presentation, That can be writing an essay, anything performance related where we're worried and we don't perform our best because we're worried about the judgment of others. The next kind is called panic disorder. And what happens when our anxiety brain goes off really intensely, we can get these things called panic attacks. And they come out of the blue, we might not realize, and they feel horrible. And our heart's racing, chest pumping, and they're so bad that we start worrying about having another one. And we might avoid places where they happened. If we had one in English class, we might not want to go back. So panic disorder is where we avoid things because we're worried about it triggering more panic. The next kind is called agoraphobia, which is the fear of being trapped. Our worry brain is worried about being trapped, so we don't feel comfortable going to certain places because of the worry of being trapped. The next kind that's really big right now, just to be aware of, is generalized anxiety disorder. And think of this as that my worry alarm is never turning off, and it's worried about breakfast, lunch, dinner, my future, and it can't distinguish, and it's always going. And typically one way it shows up is kids with generalized anxiety disorder have difficulty going to sleep because that part of their brain is just worrying at night and keeping them up. Then we also have these specific anxieties, and especially in Colorado, that can be thunderstorms, weather-related, snow, driving in snow, and they get and interfere with our ability to be certain places that we might want to address. Another one might be bugs. Selective mutism is where we know how to speak, and it can show up in school where a kid can talk to you and everyone, but then they can't talk in class or can't talk in an environment where it's expected for them to speak. Then the last one, it's not called an anxiety disorder anymore, but I still think of it as, and it's important, it's called OCD. An obsessive compulsive disorder is where we get these intrusive thoughts that pop in our head. And that can be my hands are dirty, something's wrong with someone I care about. And those thoughts keep popping in our head, but then we feel like we have to do something to take away that thought or not let that thought come true. And so OCD, the O is the intrusive thought, like this paper has to be just right, I can only write in a certain way, or the compulsion, which is what we do. So if the thought might be, I'm going to get an F on the paper unless I write in a certain font or doing it that way, the in that way is the compulsion, and the thought that pops in your head is the obsession. And so those are all the things that fall under the umbrella. And if you're wondering about these these are things to talk to your doctor about, and you can look up and see and test to kind of see if this is what I'm dealing with. But know when we're dealing with one kind of anxiety issue, we might be dealing with multiple. And the key is really making it comfortable to understand what is our worry about. What can go wrong is how we help understand what kind of anxiety we're dealing with. So again, a quick overview of this module is this is, again, all the reasons we want to focus on anxiety and how anxiety can be one of the most problematic issues in interfering, due to both the paradox, the irony, and as well, what good treatment and effective treatment for anxiety issues look like. There needs to be skills, which will come in the next module. What are the skills we want kids to have? And then after they have the skills, we want to get them doing what they're afraid of and help them see how they can master and overcome. And so that's a big part for you all, just to remember, is whenever you let your child's anxiety kind of dictate the show, even though in the moment it might feel like it helps, long term it's causing bigger issues.